Marzahn, Tsura. The powdery smell of raw potatoes filled Tsura's head. "Wake up," Seraph said. Tsura forced her eyes open. "I'm awake." She had fallen asleep for a moment, and her instinct was to check the gun in her coat pocket. "Is this the right road?" Tsura checked their surroundings. "Yes, this is the way. Keep going." The road out of Berlin was smooth, but as they neared the edges of the city, the van shivered and jolted. Tsura rested her head on the van's interior wall, sacks of potatoes all around them. Wolf slept beside her. To Tsura, Wolf and Marko looked alike, both unshaven, dark hair. But Wolf was responsible, determined, focused, while Marko was carefree and immature. If Marko put his mind to it, he could be like Wolf. The calm sounds of the trickling water at the fairy tale's fountain lingered in Tsura's immediate memory. She had been there before as a young girl with Mother. Tsura remembered the arches and white stone pillars, and the elegant limestone statues, recalling the children's stories with which every German girl and boy grew up. Transported back to that time filled Tsura with peace, memories of a better life for her family. Meeting her brother's friend, Alex, was calming, too. He seemed level-headed and sensible. Leaving Berlin with Alex would keep Marko out of trouble. But in the dark hours of the night, when a vague recollection came to her, Tsura's unease swept over her again. The fairy tale fountain had been built decades earlier, as a memorial to dead German children killed by an epidemic. Tsura placed her hand on her lower stomach and pushed away a painful childhood memory. "I wish I could drive all the time," Seraph said, hands on the wheel, gun on her knee. "I'd love it, honestly. My father taught me how, you know." Seraph couldn't stop talking. Tonight she was either nervous or trying to keep herself awake. Seraph was talking about Marzahn now. "I'd never heard of Marzahn till I met you. Nobody knows about it. Am I right?" "I'm right." "They choose to ignore it," Tsura said, breaking Seraph's babbling. The Nazi encampments for Roma and Sinti people were unfamiliar to most Germans. "Tell me about Rastplatz Marzahn again," Seraph said. "The Olympic Games were coming to Berlin," Tsura began, as if reciting a practiced speech, but Seraph wasn't listening. She hummed snippets of songs under her breath. Tsura wondered how she and Seraph had become friends. Tsura disliked her more than anyone she had ever known. Of course, there were times when Seraph would talk constantly about avenging the incarceration of her family. It was what she and Tsura had in common, but that was all. Tsura turned her eyes to Wolf, who was still asleep. Despite Seraph and Wolf's love affair, they couldn't have been more different. While Seraph didn't know how to shut up, Wolf was usually silent, always deep in thought. Asleep, his boot tapped the van's wall with each jolt, his coat like a blanket, his head tucked down. Tsura continued the story in her head. Adolf Hitler could be tamed, Tsura's parents had said, a belief stolen from radio announcers. The world's leaders had presumed diplomacy would keep Hitler's government under control. It was 1936. Tsura was 12 and Marko was 10, old enough to remember it all. Their cousins, Kizzy and Samuel, were too small. Kizzy was a sweet 6-year-old, and Samuel, Kizzy's baby brother, was still crawling. While the world descended on Berlin for the Olympic Games, Hitler spent his time creating a grand illusion. The city came alive again. With the eyes of the world on Germany, their lives seemed safer. Tsura's grandmother prepared a small celebratory meal at her home in Charlottenburg, close to Berlin's center. The whole family gathered to raise toasts to their people, to the hope that the toxic anti-Roma atmosphere in the German capital would be somehow swept away by international peacekeepers. At the very least, they hoped the wide spotlight pointed at the Olympic stage would expose the Nazis' hatred for the Roma people. The world would listen. Then came the eviction notices. The Romani community was part of Hitler's magic trick. The games were to be picture perfect, and that meant no gypsies in sight. Tsura could remember the Nazi police pointing their guns at her and Marko, ripping them from their home, away from the city, dragging Aunt Marie by her beautiful hair, beating father and their uncles. While the adults cried, baby Samuel and Kizzy remained quiet. The Nazis forced Tsura's family to the edge of the city. No chance to say farewell to their friends. Father didn't say goodbye to his colleagues at the clothing factory, where he'd worked for 16 years. At least they were together, they told themselves. The encampment in Marzahn stood in an open field, between a cemetery and a sewage dump. Tsura's Aunt Marie, Kizzy's mother, always the one to make light of the worst, once warned them not to confuse the two. She had no intention of being laid to rest in rotting waste. Aunt Marie also poked fun at the irony of their living conditions. Tsura's great-grandparents had been lifelong travelers, but her grandparents had shaken off their nomadic traditions and settled the family in Berlin. They'd taken on a typical German name. They were proud city dwellers. Yet there they were, back in caravans, just like that. They made these kinds of jokes as people fell ill, but before the deaths. After the deaths, it was difficult to joke about anything. The conditions of Marzahn worsened. Within days, there were a few hundred inhabitants. The Roma from across Berlin, all forced into old caravans and huts, packed in like tins of smoked fish, refugees on the edge of their own city with 2 toilets for the entire camp. No running water, no electricity. Guards roamed the field and kept its perimeter secure. The closest village was a fast 15-minute walk away. The prisoners saved their crumbs, rationed their rations, cooked spoiled vegetables. They burned rotten scraps and washed them down with boiled rainwater. Sinti Germans were brought to Marzahn too. The government saw the Romani and Sinti people as the same. They were all simply Zigeuner, regardless of heritage. The Summer Olympics came and went, but the Nazis still kept watch. The news that they were permanent prisoners at Marzahn hit them hard. A rumor spread that the encampments had been part of the government's plan for 2 years. When the autumn chill settled in, some fell ill, first the elderly, then the youngest children. Malnutrition and cross-contamination led to sickness. The very old and very young were the worst affected. First Tsura's grandmother, then Kizzy, then Samuel, all very sick. Tsura's grandmother died in January 1937. Baby Samuel's health deteriorated quickly, and he died 2 weeks later. Samuel's death was shocking, especially for the adults, but they were too focused on sick little Kizzy to grieve. They breathed a collective sigh of relief when Kizzy's health improved. Time dragged on, another year passed. They became accustomed to the disease and the dying and the exhaustion. Some of the women in the camp had even become pregnant and gave birth to healthy babies. They had hope. They all adjusted. The Nazis worked them hard at factories and warehouses back in the city, even teenagers. Traveling into the city for work every morning made Tsura feel somewhat free. Even though they had to return to the stinking encampment each night, life became tolerable. They had a routine. In 1938, another horror hit. Tsura was older now. One early evening, traveling back from the city to the camp, she and the adults heard rumors that the Nazis were to send Romani and Sinti men, including boys old enough to work, to labor camps. Their parents were terrified for Marko. He was now a teenager, too. They organized for Kizzy, Marko, and Tsura to move back to Berlin. They would live with an old trusted family friend, Frau Professor Dr. Dur, a retired German academic and one of the first female professors in Germany. They would pass for Aryans, father was sure. Their hair was almost black, but compared to many in the Roma community, they were fair-skinned. Somehow, forged papers and forged Nazi stamps were arranged, and suddenly Tsura, Marko, and Kizzy were real Aryans with new boring names and ration cards. The morning Tsura was taken to Dur's house was the last time she saw her father. Kizzy had held Tsura's hand tight. Days later, Tsura's father and uncle, along with most other men and teenage boys in the Marzahn encampment, were sent to Nazi camps. Marko had been saved. Professor Dur found the youngsters new clothes and fed them well. Kizzy, Marko, and Tsura grew stronger. They heard from their mothers now and again through short written notes containing updates and promises that one day they would be reunited. Then the notes stopped. The encampment had been closed off. Tsura, now a young woman, traveled to Marzahn. She didn't dare approach the guards. As Tsura stood in the distance, her stomach knotted at the thought of Mother and Aunt Marie so close by. Tsura went back to the city. Reluctantly, Dur gave her the addresses of old friends and kind neighbors of her family, people who knew Tsura as a child. One lead led to another, and she found herself visiting a small apartment in the city. Seraph had opened the door, dressed in slim trousers and a waistcoat. A student at Humboldt University, she participated in a secret political student group organized by a young Austrian woman, also a student at the university. Seraph was not her real name. It was her pseudonym, denoting purity and pacifism. She was helping to distribute anti-Nazi flyers to encourage nonviolent resistance. She passed on information and helped dissidents connect with one another. Seraph claimed links to other resistance groups, but Tsura got the sense that she was embellishing the truth. When the student group broke up, since its activities were becoming too dangerous, Seraph began to work alone, offering her home as a meeting place for other dissidents. Tsura had wondered how Seraph could afford an apartment in such a fancy building. Seraph had pointed to missing light fixtures and empty spaces where expensive furniture had once stood. Her family had been wealthy, Seraph had explained, but the Nazi soldiers had stolen everything of value. Years earlier, the Gestapo had arrested Seraph's father as an intellectual with the wrong political leanings and sent him to the infamous concentration camp at Dachau, just north of Munich. Seraph's mother was arrested in 1940 for much of the same reasons and sent to the Ravensbrück camp, north of Berlin. Even though she was all talk, spending time with Seraph was like drinking a tonic. Her apartment became Tsura's home, and she spent hours there, along with other students and runaways who drifted in and out, listening to music old and new, taking in Seraph's stories, and always, eventually, discussing politics and the war. Tsura suggested they bomb Gestapo buildings and shared her fantasies of executing Nazi officers. But Seraph shook her head at any ideas of violence and revenge. Tsura talked about getting into the camp in Marzahn to rescue her mother and aunt and others, even killing the guards and helping the entire camp escape. Tsura checked in with Marko and Kizzy now and again, telling them she was working against the Nazis, but really, it was all still fantasy, until Wolf arrived in 1942. Wolf was different. Quiet, serious, rarely animated. While Tsura had her own bedroom in Seraph's spacious apartment, newcomers would sleep on the floor in the living room. But within days, Wolf was sharing Seraph's bed. Their sudden romance accentuated Seraph's childish side. She was always flirting and giggling around him. Tsura could tell how Wolf didn't like Seraph's immaturity. He rarely talked to Seraph, at least not in front of others, but he allowed her to hang on his arm, her hands up his shirt, his permanent shadow. Wolf rarely initiated a conversation, but he would listen to their ideas and anti-government plots and tell them how to turn them into reality. Sabotaging the Gestapo offices would involve finding explosives. Wolf knew how to get them, and he knew someone who would help rig them up. Executing prominent officers would be extremely difficult and too risky, but not impossible. Wolf knew people. He could obtain weapons. There was always a way, he would tell them, his face unsmiling. Tsura had talked to Wolf about the Marzahn camp, the Romani people, her family. Wolf never mentioned specifics about his past. He'd confided in her that his family was gone and would never return, lost to the Nazi regime. She'd asked him how he'd come to call himself Wolf. He had taken his name from the flag of one of the tribes of Israel, he explained. Wolf was a Jew. Then he changed the subject. When Tsura had suggested they go to the Marzahn encampment to rescue her mother and aunt, Wolf had ridiculed the idea as impossible. Tsura had argued with him. She'd cited tales of successful escapes and rescues from Nazi prisons and camps across the Reich, including a rumor of an escape from the Marzahn camp. They at least had to try. Just before Christmas, Tsura convinced them to help organize a clandestine excursion to Marzahn, to observe the guards and check the camp's perimeters. Nothing else. Reluctantly, Wolf agreed to explore the idea. Tsura became impassioned and focused. They would go in the dead of night. Seraph, forced by Tsura to be useful for a change, hatched a plan to find them a truck. Still, Wolf was skeptical, and Tsura argued back. But when Wolf suggested they get their hands on weapons and explosives, Tsura listened to his concerns. By the turn of the new year, Wolf announced he could obtain 3 guns. Small explosives, too. If Wolf were able to cause a small explosion close by, as a diversion, the camp guards would be forced to investigate, and the boundaries of the camp would be safer for Tsura and Seraph to penetrate. If necessary, if they found themselves in danger, they'd shoot a guard or 2. Quietly, slowly, the plan fueled Tsura's fantasies of revenge. But the Nazi crackdown tightened, and their scheme was put on hold. They heard rumors of the Gestapo seeking out dissenting student groups. People were arrested, even executed. It was too risky. Now the plan was back on. Their objectives were to count the number of nighttime guards and inspect the encampment's perimeter. Seraph had already learned the route, and Wolf had an idea of where to plant the explosives. It was Seraph's idea to use a delivery vehicle in case they were stopped and searched. Tsura and Wolf laughed when Seraph drove up in a borrowed van full of potatoes. They could take a couple handfuls of potatoes each, Seraph had said. Nobody would notice. As they approached the road that led to Marzahn, Tsura imagined herself, gun in hand, leading Mother and Aunt Marie out of the camp. She would tell them to run, and she pictured their friends behind them. But in the face of gunfire, Tsura knew the women would panic and throw themselves over their children. Tsura recalled her mother's caution, her mother's permission for Tsura to escape the camp. If we keep our children too close, we'll suffocate them with fear. Stop here. Seraph brought the van to a steady halt. Tsura elbowed Wolf in the arm and he opened his eyes. Tsura pointed to the left. Welcome to Marzahn. Tsura led them along the twisting road. The caravans would soon fall into view. Staying close to the thick bushes that ran along the pavement, Tsura led them over the hedgerow, backs arched, heads bowed. On their knees, they looked over the frost-covered hedge. In the distance, the Marzahn encampment stared at Tsura through the night air, calling out the secrets it held. She removed the binoculars from her pocket. She could make out the camp's perimeter, and her eyes adjusted to the equipment. She counted 3 uniformed guards, 2 sitting on wooden chairs, 1 standing. One of the seated men appeared to be asleep. The other 2 chatted, distracted. Tsura could see the guards' rifles held by their sides. Hopping from foot to foot, the men appeared to be cold and tired. Better for us. She led Wolf and Seraph to the edge of the bushes. It's the one on the left, Tsura whispered. Take a look. She passed the binoculars to Wolf. Don't be crazy, Wolf said, his black eyebrows furrowed as he passed the binoculars to Seraph. Tsura felt a rush of boldness move through her core. She removed her pistol from her coat and turned it in her hand. Why not? Seraph, atypically, said nothing. Tsura's heart pumped hard in her chest. Mother was close. I say we shoot them. I'll talk to them, pretend to be lost. I'll make them turn their backs and you'll approach from behind. You're kidding, right? Wolf said with a smirk. When Tsura said nothing, Wolf lost his smile and placed his hand on Tsura's wrist. We haven't thought this through. There are more guards inside that camp, I guarantee it. We should leave. No, Tsura snapped, keeping her voice low. My mother is in there. Wolf said nothing. He understands. Tsura returned her gun to her coat and removed her cap. Her thick, dark hair fell below her shoulders, and Seraph let out a laugh at her unfamiliar appearance. What are you doing? Wolf asked. Tsura smoothed down her long hair. She almost smiled at him, but harsh words found their way from her mouth. You always forget that I'm a woman. Embarrassment swelled in her chest. Why did I say that? Under other circumstances, Seraph would have teased Tsura for such an odd outburst. We won't shoot them, Tsura said, unless something goes wrong. She turned to Seraph. Aim for the Nazis, not me. Seraph let out a quiet chuckle, as if Tsura was joking. Wolf frowned, knowing she wasn't. She stood up, and Seraph let out a muffled gasp. Tsura, Wolf whispered. But Tsura, with her hair down, was already walking toward the camp. Her fingers in her pocket clutched the gun. It was a good minute before Tsura could distinguish the faces of the guards. One of them had his hand on a rifle. In his other, he held what looked like a bottle of cheap Brent wine. As she approached, she saw him stumble and sway. He's drunk. They could see Tsura approach. One of the seated guards stood up. The third remained asleep. Excuse me, Tsura called out cheerily. Without much care, the drunk guard lifted his rifle with one hand and pointed it vaguely in Tsura's direction. A swell of dread rose from her stomach. The drunk was a little older and had more military badges than the others. Can we help you? He slurred. Tsura kept her distance and forced a smile. Don't sound afraid. Is the cemetery this way? At this time of night? The drunk guard asked. Tsura took her hands out from her pockets, leaving the gun inside. It's an anniversary. I've been walking for hours to visit the dead. She could hear the truth within her lies. She remembered baby Samuel and the other dead prisoners of Marzahn. Her eyes became fixed on the drunkard's face. I should kill him. The drunk guard lowered his rifle. Go home. He slurred his words, but he said them kindly. Women shouldn't be out at this time, the younger guard added. His words were a warning, almost a threat. What is this place? Tsura asked, nodding toward the caravans behind them. They seemed taken aback by her blunt question. The drunk hesitated. It's a military base. Liar. Tsura concealed her rage and continued her improvised facade. There are too many dead soldiers. As she spoke, she stepped along the pathway. The guards turned to face her, their backs now to the bushes, where Wolf and Seraph were waiting. The third guard was still asleep. My dead Germans need to be remembered. Is the cemetery this way? She asked, knowing it was. Along the path, the drunk guard said. In his eyes, Tsura sensed pity. He probably suspected she was a young widow, or perhaps a little cracked. Tsura heard voices to her right coming from inside the encampment, footsteps in the gravel and dirt. Half a dozen policemen walked slowly toward them. More guards, more rifles. And, it seemed, more drunks. For a moment, Tsura couldn't breathe. Her body trembled. She wondered if Wolf and Seraph could see the crowd of guards through the binoculars. The guards at the front of the pack approached. Got yourself some late-night fun? One jeered at the drunk. I need to leave here. Tsura turned back in the direction she'd come from. Good night. Wait, the drunken guard said. The cemetery's that way. As the group of soldiers approached, the drunk stepped forward and gripped her wrist, just as Wolf had done minutes earlier. I'll take you there. Tsura glanced back. Seraph and Wolf were out of sight. They wouldn't have dared to approach so many police guards. She was alone now, and she turned toward the cemetery, the drunken guard walking in her shadow. The group of guards jeered behind them. You two need some privacy? One called out. Did he find a prostitute? Another asked over their laughter. The gun in Tsura's pocket tapped against her thigh. I'm trapped. Taking the deepest of breaths, she considered running from him. Thank you for escorting me, she said to the drunk. I'm your tour guide, he said to her, now by her side. Their boots crunched the gravel as they strolled away from the camp. How old are you? He asked. 19. Why? What's your name? Tsura wondered if he knew her mother. She knows him, I bet. I'm Greta. Tsura was well practiced at introducing herself with the fake name stated in her identification papers. And you? Wilhelm. Friends call me Wim. I'm 24. You look older, she said. Wim sneered, then chuckled. You look older too with my job. Tsura forced a laugh. Guarding an army base in the middle of nowhere? It's good having someone to talk with, Greta, he said with burnt wine on his breath. She could see the dirt beneath his fingernails. Inside, Tsura screamed at the thought of her family, so close by, suffering, freezing, starving to death. Where are you from? Tsura asked him. Grew up in Munich. Moved here last year. Tsura felt sick. There's a lot happening at this base. Wim shook his head. Not much. But it's good being near Berlin. That's where the decisions get made. Never thought I'd work in law enforcement. You're loathsome, Tsura wanted to say. What did you want to be? She asked. Wim took a swig of brown wine. An athlete, builder, maybe a businessman. His words were filled with pride, but his tone was of disappointment and shame. Maybe you'll get the chance when the war ends. If it ends, he said sadly. What grave are you here to see? She hesitated. It sounds strange, but I don't know. I'm not crazy if that's what you're thinking. Her fear had subsided. Wim was no threat. He was weak. You married? He asked. I bet you've got a fiancé fighting on the front. Tsura pictured Kizzy's baby brother, Samuel, and other members of their extended family. I know too many dead Germans. You're 19, Wim said. Time for you to find a good man to marry. When Tsura said nothing, he continued. I've got a wife and 2 young boys, but they're back in Munich. It's lonely here. I'm just a guard, but I want my sons to be whatever they want. I'm fighting for them. Fighting my mother? The constant pull of the gun in Tsura's coat pocket found its way to her throat, and with a hard gulp she swallowed her profanities. Don't you spend time with the other soldiers? Why are you lonely? She asked. I prefer to keep to myself. Wim swigged more Brandwein. The caravans were far behind them. Tsura thought about how easily she could shoot him dead, or even better, shoot him in the groin. He'd die slowly or be ruined for life. That was quite a party, she said, referring to the group of policemen. Do you all get together like that every night? This is a weekend. During the week, overnight, it was just 5 or 6 of us. At that entire military base? Tsura asked. That's right, including my boss. Tsura made a mental note of the vital information. What do you do here? Wim asked as they arrived at the cemetery. I talk to them, Tsura said, staring out at a field of gravestones. Wim sat on the ground close to the path. Some of my friends are dead too. My age. He drew a mouthful from his bottle. How'd you hear about this cemetery? I stumbled on this place long ago, she said truthfully, and watched his reaction. He nodded and stared out at the graveyard. Tsura remembered the men of her family. She could barely recall their faces. So many dead. As he drank from his bottle, Wim coughed and spluttered. Some people deserve to die. He spat on the ground. Who? She asked, almost shouting, willing him to give her a reason to shoot him on the spot. The communists, the Jews, the gypsies, she waited for him to say, but he said nothing. He just drank from his bottomless jar. Let's go. He tried to stand, but he fell. He laughed out loud. Help me up. He held out his arm. Tsura ignored him and began to walk back to the encampment, back to Wolf and Seraph, back to the other police guards. She could hear Wim stumble behind her. Stop walking, he said, but she refused to listen. When he ran up to her and grabbed at her coat, she became irritated and pulled away. Greta, you're beautiful. Almost falling over his own feet, Wim ran across her path, forcing Tsura to halt. As if drinking water, he took another gulp of his Brandwein. He held out his arm, the neck of the glass bottle close to her face. She could smell the alcohol. Take off your clothes, he said. Fear rose to her throat. She had underestimated this man. Her instinct was to step back, but that would make her appear weak. She took a step forward, her hand in her pocket. Tsura unlocked her gun's release. If I undress, will you tell your wife? Her question made Wim lean back, his eyes filling with regret. I said, take off your clothes, he ordered again, but this time with uncertainty. Then he pushed the neck of the bottle against her overcoat, attempting to pry open its buttons. Trying her best to hide her dread, Tsura flashed a hint of a smile and then sighed. Not tonight. She was ready to shoot him dead, but she hoped it wouldn't come to that. At least not yet. A dead soldier at Marzahn tonight would spoil any possible attempts to break into the camp at a later date, however far-fetched such a plan might have been. Her fingers around her hidden gun, she used her other hand to shove the bottle away. I'll visit again. I enjoy talking with you, she said. I like that. Wim appeared to be salivating. He lowered his arm and moved aside to allow her to walk. Tsura breathed out with relief. She needed more information. Tell me, what do you do at this base? It's not an army base, Wim admitted. It's a prisoner camp. His words spilled out like fresh blood. The other guards were in sight now, and Tsura's anxiety surfaced again, this time in her stomach. What kind of prisoners? Wim stopped on the road, sharing his secrets away from the other men. They keep Zigeuner here, he said. They, rather than we, as if he had nothing to do with it. Gypsies? Really? Tsura asked. They say the gypsies spread disease. I heard they're magicians. They say they kidnap German children. Tsura kept quiet, allowing him to continue. The gypsies made the nails that held Jesus to the cross. The Jews killed the Son of God. But the Zigeuner made it possible. That's what they say. You don't know me. You don't know my family. She expected to feel a profound hatred for the man. Instead, she pitied his ignorance. How many prisoners do you have? There's a few hundred left. Most of the men are gone. Mostly women and children now. A sharp pain pierced her chest. As they walked toward the other guards, Tsura wondered if Mother and Aunt Marie, Kizzy's mother, were still there. Were they even alive? If she were to scream their names, would they hear? The women and children, what will you do with them? She asked, her pity for Wim transformed again into disgust. We're waiting for orders. They'll probably send them east, into Poland, on the trains. His words hit Tsura hard. She knew what that meant. She'd heard the rumors of killing camps for the Jews. They're murdering us too? Trains? When? No idea. Soon, probably. At first, his drunken state prevented him from finding his pocket. When his hand emerged from inside his coat, Tsura could see he was clutching a photograph. Wim held it out for her to look. Tsura took the photograph from him. This is your family? Yes. The woman in the center of the black and white image had been caught in a laugh, the waves of her hair folding neatly just above her shoulders. Wim, in a jacket and tie, and seemingly sober, was seated, his smiling eyes staring at his wife. A little boy with dark limp hair sat on Wim's lap and frowned into the camera's lens. Wim's wife cradled a baby in her arm. How old are your children? Wim took back the photograph. I miss my boys more than I miss my wife. It's an old picture. Peter will be 5 this summer. Hans is turning 3. As Tsura and Wim approached the other policemen, the men laughed and jeered. Did you feel her breasts? One guard asked. The guard who'd been asleep was now awake and laughing along with the others. Tsura's dread intensified as the crowd of guards stared right at her. She feared and despised them all. This is my friend Greta, Wim said. She visits the grave of dead German soldiers. Their laughter stopped. Some guards looked down at the ground. That she was relying on Wim to protect her made Tsura feel anxious. Finding the courage to speak, Tsura looked at Wim. Goodbye, Wilhelm. And she began to walk away. Wim followed her along the gravel path. Greta, wait. You're going home now? Yes. I want to see you again. I work the night shift. I'm here from 7 in the evening until 5 every morning. 7, Tsura repeated to herself. Always drinking? She asked. He shrugged. In another place, Wim would have been a good-looking man with a soft smile and kind brown eyes. Here, he was someone else. Assuming she was still alive, Tsura's mother was close by, asleep and starving in her frozen Marzahn cabin. As Tsura walked away, she wanted to scream out to the sky. She implored the clouds to open, for rain or snow to wash her skin. Seraph and Wolf were in the front seat of the van. Seraph was asleep, her head on Wolf's shoulder as he watched the road. When Wolf saw Tsura, he nudged his girlfriend, and she opened her eyes with a jolt. They both seemed relieved Tsura had returned, apparently unharmed. Without a word, Tsura climbed into the van, the chalky stench of potatoes filling her throat. Are you okay? Seraph asked, holding out the binoculars. Wolf scowled at Tsura. What did you find out? Just drive. Tsura had information to share, but she couldn't talk. Not yet. As they started their short journey back toward the city, the rocking of the vehicle sent Tsura deep into her thoughts. Her family was dying, Wim had said. Soon to be sent on trains to the east. The world will be rid of us Roma altogether. She held her wrist against her stomach and pushed away a painful memory, but the stifled thought forced its way to the surface of Tsura's conscience. The regime had tried other methods to quell the Romani population. Before deportation, internment. Before internment, forced sterilization. Tsura would never be able to have children. The Nazis had made sure of that. In her mind, she walked to Mother, asleep on her bunk. I've come for you, for our people. I'd have children if I could. I'd teach them the Romani ways. The future of her family depended on Marko and Kizzy. The idea strengthened her. If she couldn't give Mother grandchildren, the very least she could do was to fight for their freedom, fight to help her brother, and to protect her little cousin. Tsura fell asleep within minutes, and the half-hour journey was over in what felt like moments. Tsura. Wolf shook her awake, tapped her face. Tsura struggled to open her eyes. Something was wrong. What is it? Seraph was panicked. She gripped the steering wheel with both hands. We had to take a detour, she muttered. The van was parked on an empty side street. The dark windows of the brick buildings around them had stared into the night. We're lost. Roadblocks, Wolf said, clearly more calm than Seraph. Gestapo. Everywhere. Tsura was shaken by Wolf's words. You didn't wake me? The distant rumbling of engines and wheels on the street forced them into silence. Get out. Seraph threw open the van door and the three of them jumped down. The freezing air and the prospect of an impending chase woke Tsura fully. Seraph ran and crouched behind a wall. Wolf grabbed Tsura's arm to follow. From where they were hiding, the sound of vehicles grew louder, and what looked like a furniture truck turned the corner onto the road. The truck stopped, and two Nazi soldiers climbed out. Tsura, Wolf, and a frightened Seraph kept their heads behind the wall, out of sight. The engine's hot, said one of the soldiers inspecting the van. Tsura reached into her coat for her handgun, but Wolf grabbed her forearm and shook his head. There were more sounds of wheels on gravel. 3 more trucks arrived. Seraph led Tsura and Wolf away from the street, and they disappeared into the shadows. We didn't get our potatoes, Seraph whined as they scurried away. Both Wolf and Tsura laughed. Seraph's out-of-place complaint was calming. Checking her surroundings, Tsura had an idea of where in the city they were. Soon it would be daylight. She needed to return to the Dewar's home to collect Alex's photographs. Tsura led them along the side of a grocery store, away from the main streets. I'll see you at the apartment in a couple of hours, she told Wolf. You'll have the documents, right? Not a chance, Wolf said. Tsura knew he was right. Obtaining false papers tonight would be impossible now. They had to keep out of sight, for a few days at least. Marko wouldn't be happy. He would need to leave Berlin alone. Without Alex, there was no other way. I have to return to Marzahn, Tsura announced. Wolf slammed his boot against the brick wall. Stop this, Tsura. Tonight you went too far. You nearly got yourself killed. Tsura clenched her fists. They're putting them on trains. Any day now. That's what the Nazi told me. Trains to Poland, Wolf. Understand? She watched Wolf swallow hard and become silent. I have to go back there. You've got some kind of plan? Seraph asked her. Tsura nodded and folded her arms. There are fewer guards during the week, just 5 or 6. I have to go back. We'll go over everything first. Wolf, please, if it were Monday night, Wolf blurted out. Tsura paused with surprise. This Monday? Wolf nodded. Knowing he wasn't happy, Tsura suppressed a smile. Monday, after sundown. I'll see you at the apartment and we'll talk it through. Seraph took Wolf by the arm, leading him away. Alone, fading in and out of Berlin's streets, Tsura could hear rumbling trucks in the distance. In her head, she could still hear Wim's slurred words. It was now close to 5 a.m. A new wave of Nazi roundups had begun. Alexander. Stretched across 2 mattresses pushed together against the wall, Alex rested his head on Marko's shoulder. They hadn't slept at all. The soldier had seen them kissing, but they'd managed to lose him. Alex shook his head. How could we have been so stupid? Thankfully, Marko had figured out where they were and led them to their hiding place, an abandoned basement Marko had discovered months ago, close to Motzstrasse, south of the Tiergarten. Even though they'd been coming here since early autumn, Alex still found this part of the city confusing. He wondered if professional cartographers needed to recall every aspect of the terrains they drew. Maybe I'll create puzzles for a living. One day, I'll write this all down, Alex said. Marko kissed Alex's forehead. Even that? Especially that. Marko had found the old mattresses, too. They were certain the building had been an old bar or restaurant, and this had been a wine cellar. This was their first time here at night. In the near darkness, the shadows of the empty wine barrels stacked along the back wall made repeated sharp patterns on the plaster. Through the rusting barred windows close to the low ceiling, they could see the street. Buildings and leafless trees stood silent against Berlin's night sky. Marko laughed, his fingers on Alex's coat buttons. Broden, this coat. You leave me alone, Alex said, knowing Marko was teasing. When father had given Alex his expensive overcoat, Alex had felt like Joseph, the youngest and favorite son of Jacob, the Jewish patriarch. When Alex had realized he'd forgotten his photographs in his other coat's pocket, he felt as though he'd betrayed his family. Marko drummed his knuckles on the cellar's cold wall. Pieces of plaster cracked and fell to the damp floor. Then he took out the soldier's medal from his pocket. Marko sat up and scraped the metal's edge against the cracking plaster. Alex squinted through the darkness at Marko's carving on the wall, the letters M and A. If we get separated, we meet here, Marko said. The idea of being separated from Marko filled Alex's gut with dread. But that won't. Marko kissed his mouth. Alex pulled away to continue. After we leave Berlin, if we lose each other, find the Broden family in London. Find any synagogue, and they'll help you. Tell my family you know my father. Give them his name, and tell them you know me. That I'm your boyfriend? Marko said. Don't joke. Leah Fetterman would have been shocked if she knew about Alex and Marko. Their colleagues in the brewery office made joke about Leah and Alex marrying one day. If Alex were different, if he had any interest in women, Leah would have been his girlfriend and eventually his wife. Here with Marko, the idea was ridiculous. Marko is my future. In London, where are we going to live? Marko asked. With my cousins. Or our own place. I can't speak English. Neither can I, Alex said. They lay staring at the basement ceiling. But we'll study and learn professions. Marko smiled his broad, scruffy smile. Study? A smudge of dirt sat across his forehead. His black hair smelled of cigarettes and fell perfectly over his ears. Alex imagined himself older. Fine, I'll make maps. You'll stay at home. Doing what all day? Marko lifted himself up with one arm and leaned over to kiss Alex along his jawline. His shirt collar was open, and Alex could make out the graze above his collarbone. Alex pressed his knuckles against the scrape on Marko's neck and kissed him back. Even though the concrete floor was damp, even though the wine cellar in the darkness resembled a prison, Alex wished he and Marko could stay there like that until they were old and frail and forgetful. I liked the prayer your father did, Marko said. Alex let out a chuckle combined with a yawn. That Hebrew blessing? We don't usually do that. He's not religious. He rested his head on Alex's arm. My family, too. Marko's voice became distant. I kind of remember years ago, whenever we had visitors, my parents and all the adults sang songs in some strange language. They only did all that when their old Romani friends were visiting. People are funny. Alex let out a sound of agreement. He was drifting off to sleep. Your father's name is Sam, right? Marko asked. Yes, Samuel. My cousin, Kizzy's little brother. Marko spoke with hesitation. He had that name too. Alex opened his eyes. He died? Marko rarely talked about his family. Marko nodded, puffed out his cheeks, and let out a heavy sigh. Look at this, he said, sounding upbeat now. Marko pulled up his shirt sleeve to show off a watch. Its leather strap was black, maybe dark brown, its round face white with a silver frame. I love it, Marko said. Where did you get it? Marko grinned and gestured to his bag on the floor. I found it. Alex sat up, his eyes narrowing. He remembered Tsura's accusation that Marko had stolen the bag. I'm not a thief, Broden. God, just because I'm a gypsy. No, Marko, I'm sorry. I wasn't suggesting. But Marko was smirking, and he planted a kiss on Alex's mouth. We'll sell it all, but not the watch. Alex nodded at Marko's idea. They needed money for their journey. Side by side, Marko pulled Alex toward him. We won't get separated, Marko said. Alex remembered the contingency around his neck. Look at this. He reached under his shirt collar for his new chain and cross. What the hell, Broden? Marko held the cross between his finger and thumb. It was my step-grandfather's. It was Ruti's idea. She's nice, your sister, Marko said. I feel bad for missing her birthday, Alex said. He imagined Ruti at home crying over his disappearance. But I got her a great gift. Those puzzles? Marko asked. Alex had told him about the treasure hunt. If Marko hadn't sent him to that antique dealer for the photographs, Alex would never have found Ruti's prize. I found it in that shop. It's a tiny train engine plus 5 carriages, all made of porcelain. It's beautiful. My folks had an ornament like that, Marko said. Then he placed his hand on Alex's wrist and traced inside Alex's coat sleeve and along Alex's forearm. Are you cold? Alex shook his head. With Marko, he didn't feel cold at all. Franziska and Ruti will be good friends, Alex said. He felt glad they'd figured out a solution for Kizzy. Kizzy would become part of his family. I hope she got home okay, Marko said. The rumble of a vehicle on the street made Marko leap up toward the window. Alex jumped to his feet too, and stood behind him, his chest against Marko's back, feeling protected. From the basement level, they could see the lower part of what looked like 2 trucks, and the boots and legs of a small group of Nazi soldiers, maybe half a dozen. An uncomfortable swelling of heat rushed through Alex's veins and through his neck and face. Roundups. Tsura was right. Alex had to get home. He had to get the photographs and warn Father. They'd bring Father to the wine cellar. He'd go into hiding. Or maybe he'd leave Berlin too, somehow. Marko's sister would help. Alex slipped the cross back into his shirt. Marko's head jolted. Look. Alex stepped forward, his shoulder to Marko's shoulder. Through the barred window, the soldiers were now out of sight. Then a crash of glass. Broken windows across the street. They couldn't see around the trucks. For a moment, the street was silent. Then distant screams. The soldiers were shouting at each other, then shouting at someone else. More feet, more legs, more boots, moving quickly. Civilians. Jews? Alex whispered. Marko placed his hand on Alex's back. Probably. The shouts grew louder. The feet approached their hiding place. Alex stepped back into the darkness, suddenly terrified they'd be found. His hand on Marko's neck to pull him away from the window. Marko held onto Alex's hand and joined him in the shadows. They could still see the people on the street. One man's legs in his pajamas. A woman in her nightgown, more shouting. The guards guided the civilians. Alex counted 5 of them, out onto the guards guided the civilians. Alex counted 5 of them, onto one of the trucks. The soldiers climbed up and they drove away. Marko turned, his dark eyes studying his wristwatch. You've got to go. Alex's wrist in his rough hand, Marko led him toward the door. But Alex's gut told him to stay away from his family's house. Maybe we should run, forget the photographs. Then he thought about his parents and Ruth. He had one more chance to see them, to warn Father. Marko pulled up his collar, pushed the thin fabric against his grazed neck. Still hidden, Alex leaned in and kissed Marko's chapped lips. Marko returned the kiss, his short beard rough against Alex's unshaven face. The street was clear. When Marko opened the door, the icy air hit them. Alex understood the risk Marko was taking for him. I'd do the same in return. Slowly, over these months, Marko had become all Alex could think about. Alex loved Ruth and his parents with all his heart, but Marko was different. This was new. He wanted Marko. Alex didn't need anything else. The raids had begun before sunrise. The whole city was asleep, which Alex was sure was no coincidence on the part of the authorities. Bags in hand, glancing across the street, he and Marko could see that the doors of the apartment building opposite were wide open. Whoever had been taken, Jews, communists, pacifists, they were now on their way to one of the many Nazi labor camps. Or worse, if the rumors were true. As the young men walked east toward Alex's home, they kept on the side streets as much as possible. Marko in front. Each time they heard vehicles on the road, they stepped into a doorway out of sight. They climbed over hedges, through back gardens, and walled alleyways. Every step, Alex expected to be seen, anticipating another truck, another Nazi soldier around each corner. They stood on the western edge of the Friedrichshain neighborhood. Alex's street was 2 minutes away. They needed to meet Tsura by 11 in the Moabit neighborhood, and Alex worried it would now take longer to get there with the Gestapo swarming the streets. We don't have much time. We're fine, Marko replied. Wait here. I'll come with you. No, stay behind the houses. Outside is safer. Marko nodded. Be quick. They dared not kiss. Not again. Not out in the open. Alex held out his suitcase. Take this. As Marko grabbed Alex's case, their fingers touched. Marko's hands were so cold. Here, Alex said, and took off his father's coat. Fine. Marko, you're freezing. Paul, Marko said with a wink. Quickly they exchanged coats. Marko shivered and fastened the fancy buttons. The dark, rich fabric of the coat made Marko look less disheveled. The collar sat high, covering the scratch on his neck. Paul never suited you. Marko laughed, his eyes shining. You look good in my clothes, Broden. Alex grinned. Marko Lang. Wearing Marko's shabby coat felt good. They did this in ancient times. Did what? Exchanged cloaks. Marko looked at him, puzzled. It's a great story, Alex called out as he walked away. In Marko's thin coat, even the 2-minute walk to his house became difficult. Instinctively, he checked the coat's inside and outside pockets. They were all empty, and the coat's lining was thin and torn. Alex wondered how Marko could tolerate this cold. Alex added a step to his plan. Not only would he fetch his photographs, but he'd switch Marko's coat for another. The silence of the early morning was broken by sounds of more trucks in the distance. As much as Alex wanted to sit and talk with his parents and Ruthie, he wouldn't be able to stay for long. He tapped on the window pane and heard someone coming to the door. "Mama, are you okay?" Mother threw herself at him, her arms open. "Wake Papa, quickly." "He's at work. He left a while ago." "Oh, God. Already? My coat. Mother was smiling. In her long nightgown, she closed the door, stepped over to the hallway telephone table, and picked up his 2 photographs. "Look what I found." A breath of air tumbled from Alex's throat. "Thank you." She smiled at him and touched his face. Alex held the small photographs in his hand. "I need to go, but we need to warn Papa." Her smile broke. "Why?" Alex tried to sound calm for her sake. "Roundups. We have to let him know. There's somewhere he can hide. You go. I'll call your father at the factory." Taking Alex's wrist, she kissed his hands and held him again. "Go safely." As she picked up the telephone receiver to call Alex's father at work, she didn't notice a piece of paper falling to the floor. It was one of Ruthie's birthday treasure hunt clues, with one of Alex's key words written across the front. Alex picked it up and slipped it inside Mother's telephone number book, making sure the note was visible. He discarded the idea of heading upstairs to wake Ruthie on her birthday and wish her a final farewell. Looking around, Alex spotted his coat, the one in which he'd left his photographs, folded over a chair in the dining room, but fists on the front door startled him. He spun to face Mama. She dropped the phone receiver and, saying nothing, pointed for Alex to run upstairs. His heart in his throat, Alex ran, treading lightly as he could, 2, 3 stairs at a time. Behind him, the door rattled again. "Just a second," Mother called out, her voice calm and slow. By the time Alex reached the upstairs landing, strange voices were filling the downstairs hallway. "Turn on the lights," a man's voice demanded. "Where is Samuel Broden?" "They're looking for Papa." Alex rushed into Ruthie's room, making no sound, closing her door behind him, the photographs in his hand. "I shouldn't be here. God, Marko's outside." "Ruthie," he said in a panicked whisper. Ruthie looked up at him, bleary-eyed. "Alexander, what's—" He held his finger to his lips. "Pretend to sleep." The loud voices were on the staircase now. With her hand, Ruthie covered her mouth. As she threw the blankets over herself, Alex dropped to the floor and crawled under his sister's bed, Marko's coat on his back. "Ruth." "This is a rehearsal," Ruth told herself, but she knew it wasn't. She'd been half awake for a few minutes, listening to Mama talking to someone downstairs. It had sounded like Alexander, but Ruth had thought her mind was playing tricks. She'd been imagining all sorts of things. Alexander was returning as a birthday surprise, she told herself. Or he was no longer leaving Berlin. But when she saw Alexander's panicked eyes, Ruth knew something awful was happening. Her eyes were closed tight, heart thumping. She heard her door open. "You, girl, get downstairs," a man shouted at her from the doorway. She pretended to wake with a jolt. She didn't need to pretend to be terrified. As she followed the soldier's orders, she purposely let the blanket hang over the side of the mattress so it touched the carpet and covered the gap between the floor and her bed. Barefoot in front of the Nazi soldiers, Ruth realized she had left her glasses on her nightstand. At the same moment, she heard the lightest rustle of bedsheets behind her. "I can't see. I need my glasses, okay? I'll just be 1 second, okay? I'm really sorry." Ruth rambled and spoke loudly to hide the sounds Alexander was making. "Be quick!" one of the soldiers yelled. Ruth returned into the darkness to her nightstand. As she put on her glasses, she almost gasped to see the edge of her bedsheet hanging from the wardrobe's top shelf. Alexander had climbed inside, just as he'd practiced. She took her dressing gown from the hook on her wardrobe and nudged its door closed, the bedsheet now out of sight. Walking out of a room, Ruth trembled. Alexander shouldn't be here. Why did he come back? More Nazi officers were at the bottom of the staircase. Mama stood next to them, and Ruth ran down the stairs and into her arms. Mama combed Ruth's hairs with her fingertips. "It'll be okay," Mama whispered. With Alexander hiding in her bedroom, Ruth didn't believe her for a second. One officer held a pile of papers, a list. "Where is Samuel Broden?" His voice boomed, loud and scratchy. Mama began to speak. "I was talking to the girl," the Nazi snapped. He glared at Ruth. "Where is your stepfather?" Ruth shivered and shook her head. If Papa wasn't at home, he must have already left for the factory. Unless he was hiding, too. "Maybe at work?" Ruth blurted out. "And where is Alexander Broden? He's your stepbrother, correct?" Ruth couldn't catch her breath. "Oh, don't be shy," the Nazi said in a sinister tone. "Yes, he's my brother." Her parents had said this might happen one day. They would round up the last of the Jews and few Germans would object. When she turned to look at Mama, the officer grabbed Ruth's face, forcing her to stare forward. His hand was hot. His palms and face were covered in sweat. Only an overfed Nazi pig would be sweating in February. Ruth prayed she wouldn't give anything away. She hoped her answer wouldn't contradict what Mama had already told them. "Where is Alexander Broden?" At first she struggled to speak. "At work, too, maybe?" "Why are you unsure?" the pig asked. "Because I just woke up," Ruth snapped, surprising herself with her confidence. A yelp from upstairs made Ruth jump. "Alexander!" Boots appeared at the top of the staircase. When she saw her brother behind a soldier and in front of another, she let out a shriek, and Mama dug her nails into Ruth's arm. They found him. "Dear God!" Mama shouted. Alexander looked at his sister and mother as the Gestapo officers marched him down. Hiding in the girls' room, one of the soldiers reported to the officer in charge. "This is your brother?" the pig asked. Alexander stood at the front of the stairs. "No, Veska, I'm Paul Veska," he lied. Ruth gulped a mouthful of air. Before the Nazi could respond, Mama stepped away from Ruth. "Under this roof?" she shouted at her daughter. Mama's arms were flying. At first, Ruth didn't understand. "Never in my life. Never. Ruth Broden, you should be ashamed of yourself." Mama seemed genuinely angry. She turned to Alexander. "You too, Paul. Never in my life. Just wait until your parents hear about this. I swear, Paul Veska, you will never, ever set foot in my house again." "Mama, I'm sorry," Ruth said, playing along. "What is all this?" the fat pig demanded. Ruth purposely hesitated and pretended to be embarrassed. "He's my boyfriend." With a look of disgust, Mama began to shout again. "What will everyone say? I am so ashamed." She looked at the fat Nazi officer. "What would you do if your daughter had boys creeping around your home in the middle of the night, sharing a bed, doing God knows what?" She looked at Ruth again. "I don't know what else to say. I should throttle you." The Nazi was staring at Mama. "If my daughter behaved like a prostitute, I'd teach her a lesson and beat the life out of the boy." The fat officer stepped toward Ruth's brother. "Trousers down," he yelled at Alexander. Alexander looked startled. "Do it." As Alexander unbuckled his belt, Ruth looked away. Mama averted her eyes too. Ruth knew what they were doing. They were checking to see if Alexander was a Jew, to see if he was circumcised. They did that sometimes, Papa once said. Now Ruth knew he hadn't been joking. Alexander yelped. He was doubled over, his trousers and underwear around his knees, his shirt hanging over his naked thighs. Ruth looked away again. Her brother was coughing and moaning in pain. The Nazi pig stepped toward Mama. He raised his arm toward Ruth. His hand missed her face and his palm landed hard on Mama's head. He pulled hard at her hair. "Liars are worse than whores," he said. "Don't touch her!" Ruth screamed, throwing her arms around Mama's neck and pushing the Nazi away. Ruth looked back at Alexander. He was holding his trousers up and staring at the floor. Mama shouted again. "I'm a German mother and this is my son. As Christians you should be ashamed. My husband and I worked for the old government. My father fought in the Great War. They were patriots. I have true German blood." With a sneer on his sweating face, the pig nodded to an officer to march Alexander outside. His hands behind his back, Alexander's shirt was a mess, his belt undone. His face and eyes were red. "Everything will be okay," Mama said to Alexander, her voice resolute. Then she turned to the Nazi, her voice softened now. "Please, you don't have to do this." Tears were stuck in Ruth's throat, and a tingling moved across her skin as if she were floating above the hallway floor. "I'll be fine," Alexander said with a tone of defeat. The two officers dragged Alexander toward what looked like a removal truck. "Samuel Broden," the fat pig said. "Search every room. If the boy was hiding, then his Jew father is hiding too." The officers climbed the staircase. "Mama!" "Your papa's at the factory," Mama whispered, dousing Ruth's worst fears. She and her mother listened and flinched as the soldiers overturned furniture. Cupboards emptied, crashing and more crashing. Both in their nightgowns and robes, both in bare feet, Mama led Ruth into the dining room, and they sat at the table, saying nothing, holding each other's arms. Despite her composure, Mama was trembling. "Ruthie, don't let them see you're frightened. They want to see us terrified." The soldiers returned from upstairs. When the Gestapo pig walked into the dining room and dropped Alexander's torn-off yellow star on the table in front of them, Ruth felt sick. "We'll find every Jew in the end." Ruth felt faint as Mama stood, her head held up, looking at him in the eyes. She grabbed Ruth's arms, pulling her up to stand too. Inside, Ruth was shaking. "You should be fearful of what the Lord has in store for you," Mama said. With both hands, the pig grabbed Mama's chest. Ruth looked away. A good German woman shouldn't be sharing a bed with a Jew, or raising a Jewish child. Ruth wanted to scream. She wanted to scratch his eyes out. "I could teach you the proper ways of the fatherland." Then he looked down at her daughter and reached toward Ruth. "Don't touch me," Ruth said, and her spit landed on the collar of his uniform. The man laughed and pulled his arm away. Then he left and walked out into the street without closing the front door. They listened to the truck drive away. The Nazis were gone, Alexander with them. Ruth felt a surge of defiance. Standing up from the table and confronting the Gestapo pig had given her a rush of boldness. "We have to call the factory and warn Papa." Mama ran to the phone. The house was wrecked, furniture pulled away from the walls, cupboards opened, chair overturned, smashed ornaments. The cold wind blew in from the street. "Nobody's answering," Mama said, putting down the telephone. She closed the front door and tried calling again. Ruth walked over to pick up some of the books from the floor. In the doorway between the hallway and the living room, she found Mama's telephone book. As she was about to return it to the entry table, she noticed a piece of paper hanging out from its pages. Ruth's heart leapt. She wanted to burst into tears. She pulled out the notepaper to read Ruti and the word telephone. Her head was spinning. Her brother had been arrested. Ruth remembered the third clue she had found the night before, to find a woman's birthplace. But this clue, hidden inside Mama's telephone number book, was from another part of the treasure hunt. In a daze, Ruth found herself opening the paper to reveal Alexander's riddle inside. Hidden in rose petals, with white piping, a pickpocket in reverse. She folded the note closed. Then she saw the broken pieces of a glass ashtray around her bare feet. She stood still, staring down, wondering if she'd cut herself. "Mama!" Ruth wanted to run to her, to hold her, but tiny shards of glass surrounded them. "Ruthie, don't move. I'll get the broom." "Why did Alexander come back?" Ruth asked. "Your brother forgot his photographs," Mama explained as she swept the shards of glass away from Ruth's feet. She stopped sweeping and put her hand to her mouth. "I don't know what to do." They'd rehearsed many times for the roundups, but never for an arrest. Still clutching Alexander's treasure hunt note and Mama's book of telephone numbers, Ruth held out the book, and a plan of action fell from her mouth. "Here, call Papa's friends, his co-workers from the factory, call their families. Maybe someone will know what's going on." Mama grabbed Ruth's face and kissed her between the eyes. "You're an angel. Everything will be okay. You'll see." Mama sounded sure. But Ruth found her mother's promise difficult to believe. They'd lost too many people over the years. Papa's parents, his friends, her aunts and uncles, and Victor, Elise's brother. Mama opened her telephone book and dialed a number. "It's me, Annette. Yes, I know. I'm sorry. Listen, my son was just arrested. Yes, Alexander. I know. Yes, I think they're going from house to house. Thank you. Have you heard from your family?" No. Yes, do that. Okay. Call your sister and call me back if her husband was taken too." "Okay, bye." Yes, bye." Then she made another call, and another, calling her friends, telling them to call others. She explained everything all over again. In between conversations, she gave Ruth a commentary on what she was finding out. So-and-so's husband wasn't at work, but the Gestapo came to their home. So-and-so's wife couldn't stop crying. One family was fine but in search of a place to hide. So-and-so's husband was missing. Someone's husband had been arrested on the street. Another Christian woman's Jewish children had been taken. When Mama put down the telephone, her hands were in fists. "We should eat something," Ruth said, even though she wasn't hungry. Ruth's mother led the way toward the kitchen. "Mama, where were you born?" Ruth blurted out, wondering if the answer would help her solve one of Alexander's riddles. Mama turned to her daughter, her eyebrows furrowed. "Hamburg. You know that. Why?" "Never mind," Ruth said, and burst into tears. Standing by the staircase with their arms around one another, Ruth sobbed as she pictured Alexander on the Nazi truck, all alone. It was February the 27th, 1943. Ruth would remember her 15th birthday forever. "For the rest of my life, my birthday will be the anniversary of all this." Mama took in a deep breath. "Oh, my darling." She paused, then spoke again. "You know, Ruthie, in wartime, everyone's birthday turns into a commemoration of something so sad." Elise. Unsure if it was midday or the dead of night, Elise stared up at thousands of fighter jets that swarmed the sky, weaving in and out of black clouds. She and Victor stood in the middle of the city. Painted boxes and wooden crates fell and crashed around them. As one box hit the street, it spilled building blocks and dolls across the cobblestones. Soon the road was littered with toy bears and paper planes. Elise was horrified Victor would be seen. "Get inside," she told him. Her brother protested. "They'll find you. You'll be safe inside." Her brother climbed into the painted toy box. "Don't make a sound," she said. "Elise, I told you to be quiet." Victor sat inside the crate, his knees at his chest, staring up at his sister. His cloudy blue eyes reflected the flocks of aircraft above their heads. "Elise! Elise Edelhoff!" Victor was shouted now. Elise held the crate's lid in the air and brought it down toward his fair head. She opened her eyes with a jolt. Mother stood over her, yelling her name. A dim orange glow through the branches of a tree outside made patterns on Elise's bed covers and across the scratches on her forearm. Elise quickly slipped her arm under the sheets. "Elise, time to make breakfast," Mother said, and shuffled out of the room. Elise climbed out of bed. Exhausted, she put on her long stockings, winter skirt, blouse, and sweater. Downstairs, Mother sat at the kitchen table in silence. Elise cooked up some pancakes with jam and sugar. "Too sweet for me," her mother complained. In Elise's head, Victor sat at the kitchen table, singing to himself as he once had. It had been over 3 years since Victor had died. The news had come suddenly. There had been an outbreak of typhus at the hospital, the official report had said. Many weeks later, Father found out the truth. For the first few months, her mother's depression was to be expected, everyone said. Having a child die was the hardest thing a parent could face. Elise's father would pick her up from school, and they'd come home to find her mother collapsed on the bathroom floor, crying and shrieking. She'd scream at nighttime, too. Once, one of the neighbors complained that her mother's screaming was keeping the family awake. Father told the woman to mind her own business, as if her children's crying didn't disturb them every night, snapped. After that, their awful neighbor never talked to Elise's family. Mother didn't get any better. She refused to leave the house. She didn't clean. She didn't cook. Father and Elise took care of the housework. They'd buy food and cook it together, trying different recipes, different ways of cooking the same ingredients. On the weekends, when her mother slept for most of the day, Father would tell Elise stories from when he was a boy, and they'd play board games. When her mother woke up, Elise went to the bedroom while her parents argued. Father screamed at her mother. She needed to pull herself together. She had a home to keep, a daughter to raise, he would shout. Elise's mother didn't argue back, which made her father angrier. Last year, when Father was called up to fight in the war, Elise had told him she couldn't care for her mother on her own. He was sorry, he'd said, but on the day he left, he'd seemed relieved to be leaving. When he'd hugged his wife goodbye, he'd said nothing. Elise forced down a few bites of the sweetened pancakes. "I'm going out," she announced. Mother didn't bother asking where. Elise left her pink coat on its hook. She put on her warm girls' league jacket and her heavier, uglier coat over the top. Outside, the brisk morning was bright. At a fast pace, the walk to Ruth's home took just under 20 minutes. Ruth opened the front door, wearing her robe over her nightdress. "Happy birthday!" Ruth didn't smile back. Behind her glasses, her eyes were puffy. Her cheeks were blotchy and red. "It's my brother," Ruth said. "Alex?" Elise's mind jumped to last night, how she'd spied on Alex kissing his girlfriend. Ruth had been crying. "It's so terrible." Elise wanted to tell Ruth what she saw, but Ruth's serious tone and bloodshot eyes kept Elise from chattering. Elise stepped inside Ruth's house and closed the door. Mrs. Broden was standing in the hallway, also in her dressing gown, talking on the telephone. She nodded at Elise but didn't smile. "What's wrong?" "They took him," Ruth said. "What?" "The Gestapo. Alexander's gone. He was supposed to be leaving Berlin, but he came back and they found him." Elise was confused. Alexander had already left. She'd seen his goodbye letter. She'd seen him behind her house. Elise could only think about Victor. What happened to me will happen to Ruth. "Papa's at work. Mama's been calling around to find out information," Ruth explained. Mrs. Broden glanced at them, her hair pinned back, making her colorless face look stern. Ruth sat on the bottom stair. Thumbing the pages of her small address book, Mrs. Broden made another call. Ruth's hands were shaking, touching her face. Elise wanted to ask her if she was okay, but that was a useless question. When Mrs. Broden let out a small gasp, Ruth jumped to her feet. "Mama, what is it?" Mrs. Broden looked at her daughter, her hand covering her mouth. She spoke into the telephone. "I'm coming over right now." "What's happened?" Ruth was on the verge of tears. "Goodbye." Mrs. Broden put down the phone. "The Gestapo raided the factory." Elise watched Ruth's reaction. "They took Papa?" "All the Jewish workers were taken away," Mrs. Broden explained. She began thinking aloud, calmly. "There must have been something like 30 or 40 Jews at the factory. Maybe more." Elise stayed quiet, observing. Ruth's mother was a strong woman, not like Elise's mother, at home doing nothing. The women had been friends once. Not best friends like Ruth and Elise, but they'd been close. Mrs. Broden made another call. "It's me again." "The factory was raided." "Yes." "You heard? Tell me." Ruth started to sob. As Mrs. Broden listened and nodded to new information, she reached out for Ruth's hand. Then Mrs. Broden ended the call. "I'm heading out to East Friedrichshain." The neighborhood was a 15-minute walk away. "We're coming with you," Ruth said. Mrs. Broden shook her head. "You're staying here." "Please, Mama, they can't do anything to us. We're not Jewish." Victor wasn't Jewish. Elise wanted to interject. The government could do anything it wanted, just as it was responsible for Victor's death. Mrs. Broden got dressed. She dropped her telephone book into her handbag and opened the front door. Ruth and Elise stood in the doorway. "When will you be back?" Ruth asked. "I don't know. Before dark, I promise." She kissed her daughter on the forehead. "Now get inside. Stay warm." The door clicked closed. With streaming eyes, Ruth took a seat at the bottom of the staircase. "Stop crying," Elise said. Ruth glared at Elise as if she were being insensitive, as if Elise didn't understand, but Elise kept her mouth shut. She refused to tell Ruth she'd be okay, because if this were anything like what happened to little Victor, nothing would ever be okay for Ruth again. Marko. From the shadows, Marko had heard the truck approach Alex's street. He'd wanted to stay, to somehow warn Alex, but every part of him had known to run. With his bag and Alex's conspicuous suitcase, he needed to stay out of sight. The U-Bahn trains would be too dangerous, so he lugged the suitcase and bag and walked fast across the city, east to northwest. His throat and lungs stung from the cold air. Marko needed to find Tsura. His sister always knew what to do. He didn't stop until he arrived at Duer's place. The lights were off. The sun was almost up. In the kitchen, dirty pots and plates were stacked on the counter. He swigged the orange juice he'd left there yesterday. No sign of Tsura. Marko threw his cap and coat on the armchair and walked quietly upstairs, not wanting to wake Kizzy. Tiredness hit him. In the bathroom, he took off his shirt and stared in the mirror at the start of a beard. Above his waist, he wore only his new watch. His body looked healthy, but his face looked like hell. He turned on the tap and held his head under the ice-cold water, spraying the mirror. He grabbed some soap and washed his neck, chest, and underarms. Soaked. A noise downstairs made him hold his breath. My knife, damn it. It was in his coat, on the armchair in the living room. Footsteps on the staircase. He needed to hide. Kiz? Marko? It was Tsura's voice. Marko let out a breath of relief. Up here! His sister in her overcoat and cap reached the landing. She frowned, looking at him without his shirt. You're not eating enough. It's Alex, Marko said, but Tsura wasn't listening. Is Kizzy all packed? She's still sleeping, Marko said. Listen, Marko, I'm sorry, but I don't have the papers for your friend. You and Kizzy will need to. Tsura stopped talking. Marko joined his sister in the doorway of Kizzy's bedroom. Kizzy's bed was made. Then he knew. I told her to come right back. He'd left Kizzy with Doer out on the street, but she hadn't come home. Something went wrong. He didn't bother drying himself. He ran into Kizzy's room and jumped down to the floor to check under the bed frame. Cold water dripped from his head. He opened her cupboard. Maybe she was hiding. Kizzy! Kizzy! Tsura screamed out. Where did she go? She shouted at Marko. Tsura checked Doer's room while Marko checked his bedroom, pulling his bed frame away from the wall. Kizzy! It's us! They checked inside and behind every wardrobe. She's not up here. They ran downstairs. Marko, when did you last see her? I left her on the street was the truth, but Marko couldn't tell his sister that. Marko's head was pounding. He'd send her to the hospital. I don't know. I just got home now. I got home just now. I saw her last night when you were here. You just got home? I was with Broden. We got chased. He made it home and I waited outside, but I heard the trucks and I ran straight here. I think Broden was arrested. Marko still couldn't be sure what had happened to Alex. He hoped to hell the trucks weren't for him. And now Kizzy was missing. She never came home. He'd sent her with Doer, alone, and his gut began to ache with the realization of what he'd done. Kizzy! Room to room, Tsura checked where Marko checked, and Marko checked where Tsura checked. Marko looked in the kitchen cabinets Kizzy could have fitted into. He pushed the sideboard from the wall. Doer's china plates crashed inside. Tsura returned to the upper floor and Marko followed. She stood at Kizzy's dresser, rummaging through Kizzy's belongings. What are you doing? Maybe she left. I'm checking her clothes. Kizzy was arrested on the street. He wanted to admit his terrible mistake. Everything's here, but her coat and hat are gone. Marko wanted to vomit. Cold sweat ran down his exposed back. Where would she have gone? I don't know, Marko lied. The hospital? She told me she wanted to see Doer. And you let her? Tsura shouted. Of course not. I told her to stay here. I left her at home, and I said I was heading to Charite and I'd be back. But you know Kizzy, she never listens. What else? Tsura was buying his false logic. He pretended to think things through. He knew something went wrong on the street, or maybe Kizzy had reached Charite Hospital and something had happened there. Nothing else. Marko, get dressed. He grabbed a thick sweater and fresh shirt. Alex should have been there. They should have been preparing to leave the city. Sis, what about Broden? We've got to do something. He was... Forget him. I couldn't get him papers. They're rounding up the last of the Jews and they're deporting us Romani next. I went to Marzahn last night, and I'm going back. But first we're finding Kizzy. Tsura was talking, but Marko wasn't listening. His head was stuck on Alex. We've got to help him. Maybe he's hiding somewhere, or if he was arrested, we'll get him out. What are you talking about? Tsura shouted. You don't understand. I told Broden, no, we have to find Kizzy. She's our cousin. She's a child. Tsura was screaming now. His sister's eyes looked panicked, but only for a second. Get your coat, Marko. Tsura turned up her collar and Marko followed her outside. He could hear Tsura's voice, but not her words. The street and the buildings and the sky were blurry, and Marko's head jumped back and forth between the idea of finding Alex and the image of Kizzy pushing the wheelchair. Kizzy. As soon as she heard a key rattling in the lock, Kizzy woke with a jolt. The door swung open, and daylight from the corridor streamed in. It was Saturday morning. She'd been sleeping on the metal bed all night, its springs digging into her sides. Her coat was buttoned up all the way, and her blue hat was pulled down to her neck, her curls sticking out of the sides. She'd slept badly, but she'd slept. Her face was still stinging, and she remembered the policeman's slap. Kizzy's stomach growled, and she thought about Marko's chocolate bar in her pocket. But Tsura had taught her how to wait. She'd eaten the whole jar of jam just hours ago. She didn't need to eat the chocolate. Not yet. Wake up, my dear. A nurse Kizzy hadn't seen before held a small pile of papers in a white cup. Would you like something to drink? Kizzy snatched and gulped down the cool water. Receiving water was a good sign. Where? Kizzy stopped herself from asking the unnecessary question about Professor Dewar. There was a chance the policemen were gone. Perhaps the other hospital staff had finished their shifts. Perhaps this nurse had no idea why Kizzy was being detained. Where am I? Kizzy asked, pretending to be disoriented. Mrs. Charité Hospital. Someone is meeting you at the front desk. A sense of imminent liberation pushed itself through Kizzy's stomach and up into her head, making her want to shout with relief. Marko's come to get me. He's the only one who knows I'm here. You're to be arrested, the nurse said in an apologetic tone. As she heard the words, Kizzy felt as if she'd been clouded across the face again. She had to get out of there. If the nurse had brought her water, maybe she'd be sympathetic. I haven't done anything wrong. I need to get home, Kizzy said. Then lies poured from her mouth. My parents are dead. My grandmother's ill. I look after her and I've got to get home. She's all alone. She needs me. The nurse closed the door, then sat down on the chair beside the bed. Calm down. Kizzy made her voice sound small and childlike. What's the time? What day is it? It's Saturday morning, the nurse explained. My grandmother needs to take her medicines. She'll die without them, please. And she needs to eat. I have to make her breakfast. Why am I here? Why are they arresting me? I don't know, the nurse said, furrowing her thin eyebrows and looking down at her chart. What's your name? Kizzy unbuttoned her coat and handed her false identification documents to the nurse. I'm Franziska. Franzi for short. I can't remember coming here. Was I sick? The nurse checked her notes against Kizzy's papers. I think I have the wrong file, the nurse said, handing back the identity documents. I'll be back in a minute. This was Kizzy's chance. I need the toilet, Kizzy said. Oh, okay, my dear, follow me. The corridor was empty, and the clicking sounds of their shoes echoed on the shiny tiles. The sunlight streamed in from the top of a staircase. I should run. But the toilet closet was only a few rooms away. I'll wait for you out here, the nurse said. Inside, Kizzy's breathing was quick. She reached for a lock, but there wasn't one. This was yet another room without windows. Kizzy took her time using the toilet. As she squatted down, she looked around. Next to her, a vent on the wall, close to the floor, was just large enough for her to fit into, although she had no idea where it led. She grabbed at the vent with her fingernails, but its edges were rusted solid. Standing at the sink, she used a bar of soap to wash her hands and face, careful not to get her hat or hair wet. A wet head would make me ill. Even though the water tasted earthy, she gulped some down. The drinking made her feel hungry. Are you all right? The nurse called from outside. 1 second. Kizzy hated Marko right now. If Marko was here, I'd punch his ugly face. The thought of punching Marko gave her an idea she'd gotten from Marko. When out at night and feeling unsafe, he told her once a key can be a weapon. She reached into her coat for Professor Dewar's key. She took it in her hand so the sharp point was poking out between her fingers and she made a fist. If she needed to, she'd punch that nurse in the neck. Or she'd swing at her face. With the key in her fist, Kizzy practiced jabbing forward. Just before the nurse opened the door, Kizzy grabbed the bar of soap and dropped it into her pocket, along with Marko's chocolate. Finders keepers. Stepping into the hallway, Kizzy kept her hand and the key hidden. Her stomach growled, loudly. I'm hungry. Her hand on Kizzy's shoulder, the nurse led her along another corridor. As they passed closed doors, Kizzy wondered if Professor Dewar was behind one of them. She considered swiping the nurse with the key. Not yet. They arrived at a small seating area. Take a seat, my dear, the nurse said with a smile. I'll get you something to eat. I'll be right back. Thank you. The click-click of the nurse's shoes on the shiny tiles faded into light taps. This was Kizzy's chance. Once the nurse was out of sight, she dropped the key into her pocket and slipped off her shoes. Her stockings made no noise on the tiled floor, and with one shoe in each hand, she ran down the corridor as fast as she could toward the staircase she had passed before, toward the sunlight. At the next floor, she passed a window that was barred and out of reach. She heard talking coming from around the corner. She kept going up, jumping the steps 2 at a time. Without shoes, the marble steps hurt her feet, but she didn't care. She reached the highest floor, 5, maybe 6 levels up. More voices came from her left. Checking the corridor was clear, Kizzy turned right. Her stockings glided against the polished tile, and she almost fell, catching herself, a shoe in each hand, against the wall. Muffled voices behind her forced Kizzy to run to the closest door. Hoping there was nobody behind it, she slipped into the room. Kizzy was in an empty office. Books, files, a large green rug, long green curtains around a large window, a sofa and 2 armchairs, a fancy desk to the side. She turned to check if there was a key in the lock. No key. She ran to the window and looked down. Dropping her shoes onto the floor and standing on tiptoes, she peered down to the street below. She could climb out, but the drop was too far. Kizzy could see across Berlin. When voices from right outside the door became louder, Kizzy threw herself under the desk, crawling into the space between the chair and the desk's back panel. The door clicked open. "Take a seat," the man said. The door clicked closed. Kizzy focused on taking breaths without making a sound. From under the desk, she could see framed certificates on the wall. The office belonged to a doctor. The clock pointed to 8 minutes after 9 in the morning. "How's everything?" The man's voice was smooth and soft. The doctor, Kizzy assumed. "Good news," a different voice, croaky and loud, announced. He coughed as he spoke. Kizzy's heart stopped under her throat. "My feet! Where are my shoes?" From under the desk, Kizzy heard a rustling of papers. "An older man had a heart attack," the coughing man reported. "We had an old woman come in with a stroke. She's in the basement now, and we had 1 birth, a girl. The mother is doing well. Oh, and 1 man with a broken arm." Kizzy could feel the swirling of blood in her ears. "Dur had a stroke. She's in the hospital basement." "No complications?" the doctor asked. The second man coughed again. "None." "That'll be all," the doctor said to his coughing colleague. The door clicked open and closed. Kizzy listened to the dull sound of shoes on the rug. The doctor was still in the office. Without a sound, she turned to the side and pushed herself as far back under the desk as possible. The chair moved when she saw the doctor's polished black shoes and brown woolen trousers. The doctor sat and stretched out his legs. His shoe hit her coat. Kizzy wanted to disappear. She closed her eyes. Professor Dur's key. But there was no time to reach for it. She opened her eyes to his face, gray beard, wire glasses. He looked at her, almost smiling. "Well, hello." Kizzy said nothing. "What are you doing down there?" "I got lost," Kizzy blurted out. The doctor's face lit up with a grin, and he let out a sincere laugh. He looked down at Kizzy's feet. "Are you looking for your shoes?" He pointed to the window. A shoe in each hand, the doctor guided her to the soft green sofa against the wall. The doctor perched on the edge of the armchair. "So what's going on?" A silly idea popped into Kizzy's head. "I was playing hide and seek." He smiled until his eyes creased. "What's your name?" "Franziska, Franzi for short." She pulled her forged documents from her pocket and handed them to him. The doctor glanced down at the papers. "I prefer Franziska. Have you eaten breakfast, Franziska?" "I'm starving," she said. "Let's fix that." With her shoes back on, Kizzy followed the doctor out into the corridor. The doctor's kind demeanor made the pain in her stomach fade. But a wave of fear flooded her veins when she saw the nurse, the same nurse who gave her water, standing at the top of the staircase next to the 2 young Nazi officers. "There she is!" Without hesitation, one of the officers marched over to Kizzy and grabbed her upper arm. She tried to pull away, but his grip was too tight. "He's hurting me!" Kizzy shouted to the doctor. "What's going on here?" The doctor stepped forward. Kizzy expected the officer to back away, but he responded with authority. "We have orders to arrest this girl." "Why?" the doctor asked. The officer glared at Kizzy. "Zigeuner," he said. The doctor raised his eyebrows. He looked down at Kizzy's false document still in his hand and nodded. "Wait!" Kizzy shouted as the officer dragged her toward the staircase. "Please! The old woman who had a stroke, where is she? Her name is Dur, Frau Professor Dr. Dur. She's my guardian." As soon as she spoke, Kizzy felt lightheaded. She'd just incriminated Professor Dur. The woman who had taken her in used faked ration cards and kept her safe for so many years. The doctor took off his glasses, scratched his chin, and shook his head. Then, with Kizzy's false papers, he walked into his office, closed the door gently. A rush of nausea hit Kizzy's stomach. Her vision blurred. With the nurse leading the way, the Nazi officers dragged her down the stairs. "Please, nurse, I need to eat," Kizzy said when they reached the reception hall. The nurse walked away and appeared again a few seconds later. She dropped 2 thick slices of bread into Kizzy's hand. In a daze, Kizzy put the bread in her pocket, along with Professor Dewar's key, the bar of chocolate, and the piece of soap. Outside, a truck was waiting. "Climb," one of the officers said. Kizzy pulled herself up into the back of the vehicle. At least 24 people, mostly men, stared back at Kizzy with pity in their eyes, and one woman began to cry. Kizzy was the only child among them. She expected to recognize a face or two, but all Kizzy could see were yellow stars.